Welcome to the AWIP podcast. I'm your host, Rae Smith. Jacob's not here today, so I'm going to be flying solo as your host. Here, we focus on investigations and all things animal welfare related. We're bringing you in-depth conversations each week with animal welfare professionals from around the globe, so be sure to find us on LinkedIn, YouTube, and Spotify. To learn more about AWIP and our mission, check us out at awip.org.uk or at awipusa.org. I'm really excited about this episode. I've been looking forward to it for weeks. We have someone here from the world's largest and most well-known animal welfare organization in the entire world. So we're going to get straight to it. I'd like to introduce my guest for today is PETA's Vice President of Legal Advocacy, Dan Paden. How are you, Dan?
Good, thanks, Rae. Thanks for having me.
I'm so happy to have you here. I appreciate you coming on. This is really exciting for me. I think this is going to be really exciting for our listeners. It's really cool.
It's our pleasure. Thank you.
So, Dan, I know that you've been with PETA for a while. Before we get into our main topic for today, I was wondering if you can tell me a little bit about your background and how you got to be where you are with PETA today.
Sure. I've been with us for 22 years. I got interested in animal protection late in college and early in graduate school. Like a lot of college kids, I drank way too much beer in school and I put on the pounds. And one year, as a New Year's resolution, I decided to go vegetarian. And my mom, it was purely for health reasons. And
Sure.
my mom was a registered nurse, and she said, "That's fine. You can do this vegetarian thing, but you're going to read some books." This was in the late 90s, so the internet wasn't really great yet. But she said, "You're going to read some books about nutrition to make sure you do this the proper way."
Sure.
Fair enough. So every book I read about nutrition, B12, iron, this and that, also had the obligatory chapter on factory farms and animal welfare. And I read all those things, and I just thought I can't support this, So ended up becoming vegan, and then just decided to try to devote more and more of my time to things like that. And I went to graduate school for theology, and I just became more and more aware. I grew up Christian and Catholic, and I became more and more aware that social justice movements in the Catholic Church and in Christianity in general have obviously focused on humanity, and there's a lot of suffering there, obviously, and a lot of injustice. But those same benefits, those same principles can be applied to non-human animals and to protecting the rest of creation. And so I kind of came at animal protection from a religious and a faith-based background, and applied in 2002 to PETA. And Ingrid called me one night out of the blue, and I was shocked to hear Ingrid Newkirk on the other side of the cell phone. But I went and interviewed, and 22 years later, here I am still doing it. And the last 15 or so years, I've been privileged to work with our undercover investigations and try to expose things that are going on behind closed doors.
That's really cool. I can only imagine getting a call from Ingrid. It's like the Pope or the President calling you.
Yeah. I had to ask her to repeat herself. I said, "I'm sorry, I didn't catch your name. Who is this again?" And she said it, and I remember my jaw just kind of dropped. And I was like, "Oh, okay." And she asked me. She said, "Would you like to come interview? And how does $20,000 sound as a salary?" And I said, "To be honest, it's double what I'm making now waiting tables." And she said, "Well, how does $18,000 then sound to you?" So that was my introduction to being frugal at PETA and how we try to make every dime go as long as we can. So
that's what I noticed, and I noticed it, with pretty much everybody's salary there too. Is like you're not making what you make at ASPCA or Best Friends or HSUS, and I just thought that for anybody who goes into working for PETA, like that alone, I think speaks volumes, is that the funds that you raise from donors all around the world, really, you put your money where your mouth is, and it's going specifically to helping animals.
Yeah, I think, I've never worked for another charity, but I just know that we're very conscientious of that. And I know particularly the colleagues I work with, we know very, very well that going to Taco Bell and getting a burrito when you're traveling for work rather than going to some fancy restaurant is the way to go. People give money, hard-earned money that they, could send a lot of other places that they could spend on themselves. They give it to us to accomplish things for animals. I also happen to work, in the same department that runs our spay-neuter clinics and that does outreach to very rural and underserved areas of the East Coast, in particular North Carolina. I know that $50 can spay a cat and save thousands of lives on one of our clinics. If it means eating cheap for a few nights, if you're on a work trip, that means another cat who's spayed, and that means hundreds, if not thousands, of lives not suffering 2 or 3 years down the road. So I think we're very attuned to that, and we take it seriously. And of course, obviously, nothing that we do, we couldn't do any of it without people's support. So we're very grateful and mindful of that too.
I think that's just fantastic. So, Dan, pretty much everybody knows PETA. Everybody and their mother knows what PETA does. I mean, it's been in existence for several decades, and your work around the world on a variety of animal welfare issues. But some people maybe don't know that PETA actually does investigations. So I know that you can't really go into full detail, just like us, we can't give all of our secrets away. But can you tell me, if anything, how PETA finds cases that they want to investigate and how they conduct that?
Sure, yeah. I would say generally that we have maybe three particular ways of coming at starting an investigation. We get a lot of whistleblower complaints. We get a lot of calls from people who are employed at factory farms, in slaughterhouses, in laboratories, in entertainment settings, roadside zoos, things like that. These are people who don't agree with PETA on much of anything. They'll often preface their comments by saying, I'm not vegetarian, I'm not an animal rights person. I don't see eye to eye with you on anything except I work at this place and they're doing A, B, and C to the animals here. And I've spent a year complaining about that to my bosses and nothing is changing, In fact, they're getting mad at me for pointing out the issues. So we get a lot of calls like that, and we do our best, obviously, to address those problems while keeping in mind the needs of the complainant to usually remain anonymous. We usually, obviously, we don't want to out them. They need this job. We don't want to put them in a difficult position. We respect that. We take that very seriously. So many of our investigations are prompted by a whistleblower complaint. And so, the person who calls us, their hands are tied, but at least they give us the tip. And then we can go and have a look for ourselves. The second way that we go about starting a lot of investigations is that we might have a particular interest in a large company that's very public about its use of animals and makes oftentimes a lot of claims about how humane and how ethically sourced these products are. And we will go into their supply chain and show the company and consumers this is what those claims actually amount to for real individual animals, on farms and other locations. And the third way that we come about some investigations is maybe there's an industry out there that is using animals and that consumers are supporting, purchasing products from without having really any idea of what that entails for animals. And so, for instance, we might want to look at how are alpacas being sheared for their fiber, for the sweaters that end up on store shelves or the scarves in the winter or something like that. And so we may just pick, an alpaca farm at random and see what that looks like. So, it's pretty balanced between those three. So sometimes it's more of a campaign focus. We just really, really want to expose the reality within a particular company's chain or within an industry, and other times it's more of a immediate response to a very particular focused complaint about a very particular facility.
I just wanted to comment because you were talking about the different products, that will come into compliance and go cruelty free and stuff. I swear to God, I was thinking about it yesterday. I was at the store and I had to go get deodorant. And I checked the back. I've never done this before. Don't know why. But yesterday I checked the back of the deodorant I get, and it's got, the little bunny, the cruelty free, and it says PETA. And I'm like,
Yeah.
man, I mean, I guess I'm doing good, but that's cool though. That PETA is you're like everywhere. It's really really cool and interesting how you guys put that little cruelty free bunny on stuff to help consumers who are becoming more aware of these issues, who want to do better, but they're like, oh, I can't spend 20 minutes, on my phone in the store looking at,
Yeah.
where is this source? Is this cruelty free? It's boom, it's right there. That's
It
cool.
is, yeah, it's one thing that Ingrid and everyone else there in leadership says is that we have to expose things, we have to educate people and raise awareness, but we also have to empower people, to bring about the change that they want, and yeah, you have to make it easier for them. I just even know, in 20 or 22 years, 25 years, I guess now that I've been vegan, how much easier it's become just to go to a store. There's a V on a lot of the packaging, and that spares even me the time of sitting there and digesting this long list of ingredients and thinking, gosh, is this animal derived or not?
Mhm.
So um, it is becoming more and more easy for people, like you said, and fighting against testing on animals for cosmetic purposes was one of the things that PETA really took on heavy very early on. That was so prominent
Yeah.
when we started in 1980, and thankfully it's through decades of awareness, people are very conscientious of that, and know that they don't have to buy toothpaste that was slapped in some rabbit's eyes. That
Yeah.
there's alternatives.
And it's, I guess, like what I really like too is because you had mentioned that you get these complaints a lot of times from people who don't prescribe to PETA's views. And, you guys don't make people feel bad about that. It's like you don't have to be vegan, you don't have to be vegetarian, you can agree or disagree with as many things as you want, but we can work on the one or couple or however many things that we do agree on so that we have that one area that we can focus on where we agree and try to make things better. Is that seems like that's something that's really important to you, to PETA, to build this rapport with more people, whether or not they have really considered joining PETA or prescribed to their ideals.
Yeah, absolutely. And I see it firsthand most often when I go meet with police and prosecutors, which is a big part of my job. And, it takes me to parts of the US where animal welfare is probably not generally a priority, and where someone coming in and identifying themselves as being from PETA, I think elicits a concern that I'm going to come in with a jar of fake blood and throw it all over the office, and with a bullhorn in my hand and start chanting slogans. It's always a real joy to sit down with someone who you may not have much, if anything, in common, and just agree that none of that's really relevant right now. What's relevant is that there are animals suffering in their jurisdiction, and that the law is very clear that that suffering is illegal, and that agency has not only the opportunity and the authority, but the responsibility to respond and to do something about it. And I love fighting against that stereotype that our organization has, and showing people that yes, we do things that are loud and flashy and grab attention because, like it or not, that's kind of the media landscape these days in the US. And there's a lot of people screaming, and we kind of have to make animals' screams heard in that arena as well. But that's not all we do. We do a lot of other things, and investigations, thankfully, is one of them. And we've had, PETA started with an undercover investigation in 1980, and it's very near and dear to Ingrid's heart. And, thankfully that allows us 44 years later to keep doing them.
So I want to get to what our main topic here is, Envigo. This was a monumental, this was absolutely a monumental case in animal welfare. It was the largest and the most successful investigation really like in the history of animal welfare. It was really, really significant. So Dan, for people who don't know anything about it, don't know who Envigo is, can you tell us who Envigo is and like the backstory behind this case?
Sure. Envigo is what's called a contract research organization, or a CRO. There's a lot of them in the world. There's many in the UK, there's many in the US. In fact, Envigo has locations in the UK and the US as well. So in other words, they're kind of what we would call a scalpel for hire company. They are hired by pharmaceutical firms and others to breed animals who are then used for experiments. They also, in some instances, conduct experiments themselves on behalf of pharmaceutical biotechnology companies, etc. They were formed several years ago from a variety of other big named predecessors. And in the US, one of their most prominent facilities was, and I can say past tense now, thankfully, but it was a beagle breeding factory in central Virginia. It was in a place called Cumberland. And the facility had been in existence for approximately 60 years. It was owned and operated by a succession of companies, of CROs in essence. Envigo took it over around 2019. And it shut, thankfully, it shut in 2022. And at that time, the last day it was in operation, it had about 3,800 beagles there. But for many years, they bred and sold tens of thousands, maybe even 100,000 animals over the years. Dogs, primarily beagles, and sold them around the US and overseas directly to laboratories where any number of absurd things was done to these animals in the name of quote unquote science.
And it's interesting that you said that they started in the 1960s. That's when it was 1966 when the Animal Welfare Act was created. It's the very first creation of the Animal Welfare Act. Well, the USDA is responsible for enforcing the Animal Welfare Act. Can you talk a little bit about the USDA and their involvement with Envigo? I say it like that because I know it's coming. The USDA's, their APHIS department, their involvement in Envigo up until that point.
Yeah, it's a long story. So the Animal Plant and Health Inspection Service, or APHIS, has a division called Animal Care. And they are the inspectors who go around to the facilities who are regulated under the Animal Welfare Act, or AWA. They're supposed to be stopping by annually unannounced. It doesn't happen, but they try. They just to be fair, they're proverbially and persistently understaffed. They have a very limited number of inspectors, and they have an ever-increasing number of facilities to get to. And so a lot of the problems with USDA are, I would say, by underfunding, and I think that's something that Congress could obviously address. In any case, with regard to Envigo, in 2017, the USDA cited that facility, which was under prior ownership at the time, for some critical, direct, and eye-opening violations of the Animal Welfare Act for dogs who were very clearly denied veterinary care, who were housed in filthy, atrocious, dangerous, hot, maggot-ridden conditions, and so forth. When we investigated the facility undercover for 7 months in mid to late 2021, USDA started showing up more. They went in July 2021 and cited them for about 12 violations. we sent our investigators evidence to the facility or to the USDA and met with them. They went back in October and November both, 2021, and hit them with a few dozen more violations. They went back in March and May 2022 and hit them with even more violations. The problem is that they had this great inspection team made up of veterinarians and inspectors who we believe cared very deeply about doing their work and about documenting the problems they were seeing, and did a very fine job of that. However, then those reports landed on superiors' desks and they sat there with no action. And they sat there and sat there and sat there, and these inspectors would go back month after month and write up the same problems and more again and again. And USDA leadership was not taking any action. In fact, we found out that in November 2021, a veterinarian went and wrote a 107-page inspection report. These things are usually 1 or 2 pages. She wrote 107 pages outlining dozens and dozens and dozens of animals and other problems, evidencing violations of the AWA. And the ultimate supervisor at animal care at the time, a woman named Dr. Betty Goldentire, allegedly instructed her to reduce that document to 20 pages, and so cut out more than 80% of its content. And that was the culture at USDA at the time. Dr. Goldentire suddenly announced her retirement shortly after that allegation was published. Her second in command, Dr. Bob Gibbons, also resigned shortly thereafter. The 2 of them were called before a grand jury in the Western District of Virginia, a federal grand jury that was investigating Envigo, but also USDA's failures to do anything to stop the violations or to penalize the company. And so it's a mixed bag with USDA. On the one hand, their ground level people, their inspectors, did a phenomenal job of documenting the problems there and showing that the law was being broken. But leadership was just unable or unwilling to take any enforcement action. And that's why, thankfully, the Department of Justice was around, because ultimately the problems that were at Envigo were fixed by Department of Justice and not by animal care and the rest of the staff at USDA.
I think that's just so shocking, because most people who know a little bit more about animal welfare on the federal level, and not everybody does. A lot of people really don't understand what works, different jurisdictions, what the USDA does. A lot of people really don't understand the different levels of it and what they're required to do, let alone what the AWA actually includes and what those standards of care are. So from your perspective, then, why? Because this has been a prolific issue, I know, for years and decades all around the country, at all kinds of animal facilities, whether it's a lab or it's a breeder, or I mean, the list goes on and on. And there's a long history of violations not being documented properly, not being documented at all. These kind of warnings instead of documented violations. And there are several books I've read that highlight this, actually. There's one that I had read a couple years ago, who this woman was, not involved in animal welfare. She was just a journalist. And she had talked to Mr. Gibbons, actually had interviewed him several times in his book. I think it's called The Doggy in the Window, and talks about just the catastrophic failures of the USDA consistently over decades. And it's really eye-opening. It's eye-opening for me, let alone like already being in animal welfare and knowing a lot of this stuff. But for people who have no idea, I mean, it's just downright shocking. So, like, Dan, why do you think that the superiors are not taking this? We're not taking this situation seriously. I mean, to sit there and write over a 100-page document really says something about how that person feels, what they saw, what they smelled, what they experienced, what they heard in that facility. That why do you feel like they actually not only didn't take it seriously, but asked her to to alter her report to reduce it.
Yeah. So one of the allegations that was shared with us is that the instruction to strip the report of all the facts and the evidence essentially came shortly after an attorney for Envigo had reached out to USDA leadership and kind of, indicated that they were losing their patience with getting written up so many times, and in particular losing their patience with the team of inspectors who kept showing up in teams of 3 and 4 and going through every kennel and every dog, which when you have 4,000 dogs and football field-sized sheds takes days and days and days. So there was an allegation in a sense that maybe there was, some relenting to pressure there and to just trying to dial things back because a big company had its attorney calling you and trying to kind of put their foot on things. I think more generally, my concern is that the Department of Agriculture in general, the USDA, their mission statement, maybe not explicitly, but their purpose really is to promote the use of animals. It's to promote these industries to American consumers and also to foreign consumers as a good source of, you name it, animals for the purpose of experimenting on, animals for the purpose of keeping as companions or pets, so to speak. So to entrust an agency that's set up to promote the use of animals, to entrust that same agency somehow with going in simultaneously and policing these industries, I've always felt it's kind of a schizophrenic mission to give an agency. And there's been a lot of talk, particularly I think since the Envigo case broke and since people saw how the USDA how USDA leaders anyway had sat on this evidence and not done anything to enforce the law. And meanwhile, the Department of Justice, which has lots to do, unfortunately, took it upon themselves to go in and do this. There's been a lot of conversations about, maybe we should separate, these responsibilities. Maybe, the Department of Agriculture shouldn't be the ones who are going in and trying to enforce the law, because it seems like as an agency, and obviously it's massive and it has tens of thousands of employees, but it seems that culturally speaking, the priority there is to help these industries bring their products to the market. And, that's live animals, that's slaughtered animals, that's any number of other things that have nothing to do with animals. So there's a bill or two, I think, still kicking around Congress that would kind of empower DOJ to do a lot of the things that right now, in theory, the USDA alone can do. Those two agencies did recently sign a memorandum of understanding that they're going to work more collaboratively, and that when USDA starts seeing these chronic offenders like Envigo was, that they are expected to share that information with DOJ for DOJ's actual assessment. Whereas, previously, prior to the Envigo thing anyway, there was no responsibility on USDA's part that they had to share it. It was purely discretionary on their part. And they wouldn't exercise their discretion. I had conversations with DOJ staff about Envigo months and months and months prior to DOJ's official involvement. And, I had to have it explained to me by DOJ that they couldn't just insert themselves in a case, that they had to wait for someone at USDA to call them and say, we need your help. And the problem was that, no one at USDA was willing to do that for a long time, unfortunately.
So they're charged with essentially promoting the use of animals for food, for testing, for all the stuff. They're also supposed to police them for any type of violations. They have to actually issue those violations. And then they also have to be the ones to reach out for a larger investigation on a scale like this. It's a lot of power for one department to have, and a lot of responsibility. And really, there's no oversight over them if they mess up, if they are not actually doing their job. So
No, and
it's
it's gone through just in the years that I've been meeting with USDA. I think we're on our fifth or sixth different deputy administrator of animal care, and each time someone new comes in, I have this hope that things will change. And the first meeting, I'm like, okay, I'm optimistic. Maybe something will change, and then in a matter of months, it's clear that it's just not changing.
it's like a culture thing.
I do. I think that, it's tough. I mean, I put myself in the shoes of, these inspectors and these veterinarians who went to Envigo in particular. And I think about them a great deal because, they obviously take their job very, very seriously and were very committed to doing it. And they went and did it, exceptionally well in my view. And I think in a lot of people's view, including U.S. senators and Congress people. And then, to have your leadership, just tell you literally to just delete 80% of your hard work because they don't want to have the problems documented. And talk about just undercutting morale and undercutting, what your staff is trying to do and what your agency is asked to do. There is something that's systemic and rotten there. And I think that the animal welfare and animal rights community has been more than patient for decades. I mean, this has been going on longer than I've even been around, trying to show the feds that this just isn't, it's not working. The Animal
It almost
Welfare Act.
feels illegal, for your superiors to come in and say, "You've got this report. You need to take out this, this, and this." And I mean, can you imagine being that vet, that vet that you said who wrote all this, who spent all of this time, all this, and right? I write thousands and thousands and thousands of reports, and then to imagine giving that to your superior and saying, "This is all of the work I put in, all of the I don't know, probably dozens, maybe hundreds of hours of investigating, writing that, composing it, organizing everything, and then to submit it and have your superior say, I don't care about this. I don't want to know about this. I don't want it documented. This is something people can request for the Freedom of Information Act, your report. I don't want them to know about that."
Yeah.
Does that not feel, I mean, that feels kind of outrageous to me. It feels
Uh,
illegal, like it should be illegal.
I mean, the fact that the woman who did it and her second in command were both hauled before a grand jury and subpoenaed, I think speaks volumes to the fact that the U.S. Attorney's Office in Western Virginia and, possibly DOJ headquarters leadership in D.C. agreed, with you there. It was, I remember, the Department of Justice announced that they had raided the Envigo dog breeding operation in May 2022. And I remember distinctly that when they announced it, the reference is that federal and state law enforcement agencies were involved. And so within a matter of, I think, a day or two, we learned that that the Animal Plant and Health Inspection Service and Animal Care had been deliberately excluded from the execution of that search warrant and of that raid and of the removal of those dogs. The only USDA personnel who were involved in that operation, as I understand it, were from a completely different arm called Office of Inspector General, which has a very wide, as I understand it, has a very wide latitude and breadth of what they can do, what they can help with and assist with and investigate. And I remember, there was an article that came out a few months after the raid. I think it was by Reuters. And one of the points that was focused on there was how exceptional, not only is it exceptional that a place that has 4,000 beagles is being raided by the feds, and that they're being released and all this and that, but how exceptional it is that the very part of the federal government that should be policing this place and should have been on this was deliberately kept out, not even there. Not a single person from that part of the federal government was even on site, and I think that U.S. senators from Virginia, Kane and Warner, have been very interested in this case because it's in their state. Several other Congress people were very helpful and invested in this case. I think that something like that really caught a lot of legislators' eyes, and I would imagine probably caught the attention of secretary level people in the federal government, that Uncle Sam is not all working on one page here. You have a very strong part of the government, the DOJ, going in to do something, and they are so untrusting of their counterparts at USDA that they're just keeping everyone in the dark over there. But here we are 2 years later, and as far as we can tell, frankly, very little has changed at USDA. I don't know that the alarm was responded to. I don't know that much has changed in terms of the culture. They've had a few new leaders come and go. They've made conversations about how they're going to work better with DOJ, but we really haven't seen a lot of fruit of that yet. Maybe things are in the works. Hopefully they are. But it's a big ship. I know one of USDA's leaders told me the first time I met her that she compared USDA to just like a massive tanker on the sea and trying to turn it. That it's a big thing, and it takes a long time to change direction at a place like that. So, but we keep nudging like a tugboat, just little bit.
The hope of changing it is with things that are very like systemic like this, like they take so long, like this. Yeah. And I hope that we will get there. And I think that I really do think PETA is going to have a huge influence on that. And so I want to kind of, we've kind of gotten, these bits and pieces all throughout it. I want to go back to the beginning of the Envigo case. So how did PETA get involved? And can you walk me through chronologically so whoever's watching this understands, how did this start? How did it develop? What did they find? And what was the end results?
Sure. So we had one of our undercover investigators apply to the facility. They were hired to work there in April 2021, entry-level job, animal caretaker. Worked there for a total of 7 months through November 2021. Full-time gig at the dog breeding factory. That person came home at night, wrote log notes, uploaded video, uploaded photographs, to us in the office, which we review, the very next day. Huge facility, hundreds and hundreds of acres, thousands and thousands of animals. It takes a while to feel like you've got a good sense of all the issues at the facility and how everything is interrelated. We decided in early October 2021, that we had a sense of what was going on. We met with USDA leaders, gave them this person's signed declaration, gave them video, gave them a complaint, etc. Within about 10 or 12 days, I think they sent a team of 4 people to the facility and inspected. While they were inspecting, our investigator was still working there, and our investigator actually recorded Envigo staff conspiring to lie to the USDA inspectors about one particular practice, which was when the staff would separate the dogs from their puppies, they would withhold food from the nursing mothers for the last 48 to 72 hours that they were together. And the staff's thought, we've found no evidence to support this, but the staff's thought was that somehow that would decrease her milk production and make mastitis less likely for her once the dogs had been separated. USDA had told them to stop doing this. This is ridiculous. You can't do this to animals. Mm-hmm. They kept doing it. USDA showed up again, warned them about it again, and so they were basically saying, we're going to lie. We're going to get in trouble. We're just going to lie. So we have that on tape. We sent that to USDA as well. USDA came back in November, right after our investigator left, and the case had gone public. cited them again. The case looked, it was prominent. It was clear that the USDA had corroborated what we had found, and that we had found some things ourselves that USDA could have never known about, the things that happened behind the scenes that staff are not going to do in front of USDA. For instance, the workers there were putting down puppies with intracardiac injections in the heart, but they were not anesthetizing or sedating those animals ahead of time. So you had very conscious animals getting a needle directly into their chest cavity, into their heart.
And to be clear, in Virginia, I'm sorry, Dan, just to be clear, like for people who are listening, like in Virginia, it is illegal to do intracardiac injection. Some people refer to it as a heart stick, which is not completely accurate, but it is illegal to do that on a live domestic animal who has not been properly sedated to the point where they are completely under anesthesia or anesthetic agent, so that they cannot feel any kind of pain, because it is incredibly, incredibly painful.
Excruciating. And our investigator would find these puppies who clearly were not viable and were suffering, and bring them to her supervisor and say, do you think this animal needs to be put down? Yes. Okay. Should I sedate the animal first? No, you don't have to sedate first. They don't look too great anyway. So again and again, this happens. So between November 2021 and May 2022, we advocated with legislators to USDA leadership to say, look, something has to happen here. You can't write up a facility for 70 violations of federal law and leave it at that and not do anything about it. And then out of the blue, Department of Justice went in May 2022. They had a federal search warrant. In the first day they were there, they found and removed, I think, 145 beagles they deemed to be in urgent need of veterinary care. They spent a total of around a week, I think, on site. They ended up seizing 445 beagles. They simultaneously filed a civil suit against the company, which was ultimately successful in July 2022. It took about 2 months of a mind-numbing number of court appearances and arguments and maneuvers. Envigo was doing its best to... I think they saw the writing on the wall, that they were going to have to close this facility, and they were probably going to face the penalties, but they were really trying hard to wring every dollar they could. They tried a number of times to try to sell off large numbers of animals rather than have to surrender them or give them up for adoption. Ultimately, thankfully, the federal court said, you're not going to do any of that. So eventually, in July 2022, DOJ and Envigo came to an agreement. 3,776 beagles would be released for adoption, and Envigo would be barred from any activity that requires an Animal Welfare Act license at that particular facility. So no breeding dogs for sale for laboratories, no experimentation, things like that. So they closed the facility. The dogs removal took, the better part of, I think, 6 to 8 weeks. And there was a large number, obviously, with that many animals, a huge number of animal welfare and sheltering organizations obviously had to play massive roles in that.
I can imagine it was a huge collaboration with people all. Do you know who all was involved? Were any national organizations involved?
So the DOJ had the Humane Society of the United States manage the whole thing. So they came in and coordinated it, and they oversaw all the placement, essentially. They took possession of the animals themselves, but they also obviously lined up sheltering partners from around the U.S. and I think kind of oversaw that. I think animals from that facility went to probably every state in the union. There were a bunch of Virginia organizations that we took in 25, I think, one day. And they took over an entire floor at the PETA headquarters and had a blast, as you can imagine. And so that was over with by September 2022, and I think the question on everyone's mind was, good, the animals are out, facility's closed, but someone's got to pay for this, and not in a retribution kind of way, eye for an eye thing, but
Right.
this was systemic wrongdoing, and there needs to be consequences and accountability for that. And we need to put some plans in place to make sure it doesn't happen all over again.
And I can imagine all of those thousands, over 3,000 dogs would need veterinary care, checks, all kinds of stuff.
Hundreds and hundreds and thousands of dollars. And there was recently a story in Los Angeles. I think it was the 2-year anniversary, coming up of certain dogs' arrival out there at a rescue. And one of the people who had taken in some of the Beagles, kind of lamented that, the cost of the damage that Envigo did to these animals was borne by nonprofits, and it was borne by good people who took these animals in. So you have this multi-million-dollar firm that had profited off these animals for years and years and years, finally waved the flag, gave up the animals, and now you've got, good, hardworking people who are out of the kindness of their heart providing for these animals, having to find it in their budgets to provide for these animals' needs. And that's tough. And eventually Envigo was convicted. They entered a plea deal with the DOJ earlier this year, and they were convicted on 2 federal criminal charges, 1 Animal Welfare Act, 1 Clean Water Act violation. And they had to pay $22 million in fines, and about another $13 million in penalties. But, not a penny of that went to families across the U.S. who took in their victims. And the deal was massive and historic. It's the first time someone who supplies animals for experimentation has been convicted of a federal crime. So it's history. The fine is the largest in the history of the Animal Welfare Act. So it's precedent setting in virtually every way. But, it does raise questions about, who ends up ultimately paying the bill for the victims. And that's just good Americans who, thank God, took in these animals and are providing for them.
Well, I think it's necessary, reflect in these cases. And I don't know if anybody, if you guys and the Department of Justice and everyone got together to kind of like have a debrief about what happened, but kind of, outlining the successes. And I don't want to necessarily say the failures, but things that, we could have done better. We could have asked for more. We could have, changed in some way in hindsight for when, not if, when this happens again.
Yeah. We've had meetings with DOJ since, and I think in a lot of ways, really the way that DOJ handled this can be a roadmap for future cases. Because as you said, it is going to happen, and DOJ is going to need to step in and handle these things going forward. So in a lot of ways, I think this was instructive. I wish that USDA would evidence that it got the message here, and that it sees that it has a strong partner in the DOJ. If they want to see themselves as more of a regulatory agency that maybe finds the problems but doesn't necessarily tackle them in court, and they want to just kick that to the DOJ, I think that most animal advocates, I think animals themselves, would be quite pleased. I think the DOJ knocked it out of the park, obviously, with this, especially in court. Yeah, I think going forward, when you have compensation and when there's fines and penalties being levied, that it would be nice to take into consideration who takes in the victims and the reality of providing for those victims long term. A lot of these animals were puppies. They've got, thankfully, more than 10 years ahead of them. But they were mass bred in one of the biggest puppy mills in the country, frankly. And they're the sweetest of animals and most docile. Arguably, that's why experimenters like to use them. But they're also not free from medical problems and behavioral issues. And I know a lot of them have faced some really uphill battles once they come out. And I do think it's worth considering going forward whether, when you're putting a massive conglomerate on the hook for violating federal law up and down, should part of their restorative payments be to the good people who take in their victims?
It kind of reminds me of the Michael Vick case decades ago, but he was on the hook for paying for, I think it was like $1 million fine for the care and upkeep of the dogs post conviction, which was a thing because he initially didn't, and so they had to go after him for it. But I mean, it was the first time that the U.S. government had possession of dogs. Like, they belonged to the U.S. government. What are we going to do with them? We've never dealt with this before. And so, like, it's understandable that they're not really great at, finding, all of the fines and the justification behind all of that. But I think we'll probably get better over time the more that we do this. And
Yeah.
Dan, before we wrap up here, I know that this was kind of a lot of doom and gloom. There was a lot of good stuff. There was a lot. I mean, right? It was historic. We went over that. This was like absolutely like amazing investigation series of events. Okay, but you said that you had brought some of the Beagles to PETA's headquarters after.
Mhm.
What was that like? I mean, what were they like? What was the staff like? Like, what happened? What'd you feel?
Well, I mean, they were chaos. They were pure chaos. It was great. They were, they were excited to say the least. Very, very loud, very energetic, having a blast. Um, you know, a lot of people who took in the Beagles, and I would say the same thing about those I met, comments about how they just don't know how to be dogs.
Mm-hmm.
They were raised in cages, they were raised in kennels. They had virtually no human contact whatsoever. What little human contact they had prior to leaving that facility was people coming to do terrible things to them, coming in with a pressure hose and spraying out a kennel while they're, cowering in the back corner trying to get out of the spray, and, things like that. So, but they were terrific. They played, we had them in, I think, 6 or 7, we call them guest rooms. They're essentially old office spaces that we've converted into, shelter situation with tiles and couches and sheets and fleece and food and water and toys and places to eliminate your waste, the whole 9 yards. We found homes for them in no time flat. People were lining up to take in a famous Envigo Beagle, So it was great, that there were a few of us who had worked on the case. I worked with our investigator for 7 months, and with a lot of investigations, the investigator has to leave the facility without an animal. I never get to meet any of the victims. Sometimes there's no seizure. Sometimes victims stay inside, and you don't get that joy, that satisfaction. This time we did, which was great. So you get to meet some of the actual individuals you're advocating for, and you get to see them having the life that they've been denied for a long time. Fines are great, convictions are great, raised public awareness is great, but it's tough to compete with seeing an individual and just seeing their entire world transformed overnight, and know that they could have spent 6 or 7 more years in that place being bred, or they could have been put on a plane and shipped to the UK and had something, I won't go into details, but something terrible done to them. And to know that none of that's ever going to be in their cards, and that all they have to do now is just be a silly beagle and play.
Well, is there anything else that you want to tell our viewers, anybody who's listening to this, about you, the case, PETA, your mission?
We are here to help other professionals in the field as much as we can, anytime we possibly can. We have a lot of experience with law enforcement. We have a lot of experience with animal control and sheltering agencies. Respect and love and admire people who do it. A lot of people came from that background at PETA themselves, and We know that the job is difficult, to say the least, in every way. And so if people ever feel like they're at their wits' end and, they need big bad PETA to come in and be the angry person who makes noise to change things that maybe they can't change in their organization or their community or their jurisdiction, we're probably happy to do that. So just call or write or email anytime, and we will be. And even if you don't agree with us on everything, that's irrelevant. That's totally fine.
How can anybody reach out to you? Is there a phone? Is there an email? Is there a website?
Yeah, so our website is just PETA.org, PETA.org. The main email is info at PETA.org. The main number is 757-622-PETA, which is 757-622-7382. We're always here. We have 24/7 pager coverage, so even if it's an emergency, you can reach a live person in no time flat. So, and thank you for everything that you all do and that your listeners do.
Well, thank you, Dan. I think this was fantastic. I really, truly appreciate you coming on, talking with me, helping educate anybody who's listening to this about PETA, your mission, everything that happened with Envigo, what the future looks like for animal welfare. I can't thank you enough for coming
Thank
up.
you. My pleasure. Thanks so much for your time.
So thanks, and also thanks to all of our listeners for tuning in. We love questions, so you can always feel free to reach out to Dan. He gave you the info there for PETA. You can reach out to me. Jacob's not on this call. You can reach out to him. We are on LinkedIn, and we will be posting these videos up every Tuesday. So this will come out next week. Every Tuesday on LinkedIn, YouTube, and Spotify. And I just want to say thanks once again to Dan for coming on. To our listeners, we all appreciate you listening to this and for supporting AWIP in our mission. So we'll see you next week.